Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, and you're listening to Tech Mirror. My guest today is Professor Ciaran Martin. Ciaran was the first CEO of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre, which is part of the GCHQ. For those of you in Australia, this is the partner organisation to the Australian Cyber Security Centre, part of the Australian Signals Directorate. Ciaran has since retired from that role, and he is currently the Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at Oxford University. Ciaran, we are absolutely delighted that you're able to join us today.
Thanks for having me, John. It's great to be here.
So we thought we would ease us into a chat with a question that we ask most of our guests, which is just to take you on a trip down memory lane to share a little about the first time that you encountered a computer, or that maybe the first time you encountered the internet. It's something that's so embedded in our lives these days, and we forget that there was a time when it wasn't there.
Well, my confession is I am non-technical, and so my background in computing was not one that led me to be an obvious choice to be head of the National Cybersecurity Centre. In fact, when I was brought out to GCHQ, I almost argued against my own appointment. We might come on to that. I didn't spend a great deal of my youth on computers. We sometimes had some at home. We had the delightful BBC Micro computers, which were common in educational circles. We used to get old ones that schools were finished with, but we used to sort of play games. And so my brother did quite a lot of coding and programming. I did a little bit, wasn't very good, and sort of abandoned it and went into arts degrees. I then, when I joined the civil service, it was just at the dawn of the age of the internet, and actually in junior roles you're doing quite a lot of parliamentary research. So I do remember that sort of transformation from being in the dungeons looking at Hansard to just looking at it online. Then as I encountered national security roles a bit more in the mid-2000s, I remember just people, as I went on to become, making it harder for you to use the internet because of this thing called security. And to sort of sum it all up, there was a glorious moment where when I went to GCHQ in the role that became head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, but that was my idea, so that wasn't the role I joined. I was actually sent out because I'd done a lot of sort of policy troubleshooting in the Cabinet Office, the equivalent of the Australian PM&C, on national security issues, and Snowden had just hit, and of course the Five Eyes SIGINT agencies were all in crisis, and they'd been very secretive up to that point, still are, but not nearly as secretive as they used to be pre-Snowden. And because of that secrecy, they didn't have sort of press offices, big legal departments, big policy departments, and now the little press function, for example, had been used to dealing with the Gloucestershire Echo about the sort of community events in Cheltenham, and now it was getting calls from the Washington Post and Der Spiegel and the Sydney Morning News and so forth. Not just the British papers. Parliament was demanding a review of legislation and so on. So I was sent out to manage that, and they said, but you could have a long-term future here doing cybersecurity. So I remember talking to a friend. I was 39 at the time, and I'd known this guy since I was 4. We went to primary school together, and I was telling him about this job and seeing what his reaction would be, and he just said, but what do you know about computers? So the answer was not very much. Some would say that that's still the case. The more serious point in it is that cybersecurity, I think, it's now widely recognised that there is no substitute for deep technical expertise, and the people that were there in GCHQ who became the bedrock of the NCSC, which is some of the best technologists and operational cybersecurity people in the world, and they were absolutely amazing. But in terms of things like incentives, getting policies right, strategy, we were doing quite a lot wrong. And sort of, I spent quite a lot of time trying to learn at least enough of the technology to talk to the technologists, but also try and find ways of communicating that to the policymakers. And that was the niche that I occupied. And it was right place, right time. I think, over time, I hope more people in generalist civil service roles like me, people who are 25 years younger than me, will have more computing skills, and I think the education system should be reconfigured to make that the case. But there'll always be, I think, a role for people occupying that space where the detailed tech meets the real world, and that's where I've been.
And it's interesting hearing you describe that path, because I think increasingly there are people looking to what has happened in cybersecurity and the increasing presence of policy and diversity of people engaged in the making of cybersecurity policy and driving better cybersecurity outcomes, and saying, how do we mimic that in the broader tech policy environment? And it's a conversation that I'm having quite regularly. So it's wonderful to hear your description of how you ended up there. One of the things that really stood out to me when I read through bio, Ciaran, was that you just described yourself there as a generalist, and you've had elements of your career in the security services, you've worked in the Cabinet Office, in the Treasury, and you say that the constant theme through all of this has been the promotion of responsible and values-based government. And it just stood out to me because we talk about values in technology a lot now, but it hasn't always been the case. And I wonder if there was a point, and maybe it was during managing the fallout from the Snowden disclosures, but was there a point at which you suddenly realised that, or had the realisation of the impact of, or how embedded the values proposition is in technology?
I think there were various points, but one would go back to I was doing a national security policy role way before Snowden, where a lot of it was around challenges to the actions of the security services post 9/11 and so forth. There were all sorts of allegations about alleged complicity in alleged American mistreatment of detainees and things like that. But as part of that role, a new job in the Cabinet Office of Director, essentially, of Intelligence Policy was created. And I remember visiting the Metropolitan Police, and they had a very powerful set of capabilities which were being used in things like countering kidnaps and so forth. But part of the issue, and it's still a live issue, particularly as we move towards things like facial recognition technology, is the fact that for a bunch of historical reasons, the UK in general, and London in particular, has more closed-circuit television cameras per square inch than pretty much anywhere in the certainly anywhere in the Western world. And I remember looking at that, and you could have demonstrations of the capability that were absolutely lawful, where you just could see the power of this, and you could see the power of it in operations. And there was a live kidnap operation going on at the moment where this stuff was absolutely invaluable. But you could also see that you could just pick somebody up on a street. And I remember, because it was a lawful demonstration, we were able to do that for a few seconds and so forth, and you could see that. And it was that classic, this is possible there, but just because you can do something, should you? And if so, when and under what circumstances? I suppose then, I think partly in terms of one of the sort of value issues that I became quite strong on, and this developed a lot in the post-Snowden phase, was about how you get some form of informed citizen consent for this sort of thing. And in the case of the CCTV cameras, there was a very powerful capability there, and I think and the police were beginning to take actually quite positive steps to explain how they used it. It was always going to be controversial. In the case of Snowden, it was the other problem. It was the fact that nobody had thought, in the really secret days, nobody had thought to say, look, we're building up this huge set of capabilities. They're very powerful. So we're not going to tell you what exactly they are, because that would blunt their effectiveness. We're going to sort of talk a little bit about the framework, the sorts of things we might do, the way they're controlled and so on. We didn't do that. And the reason why that proved to be a mistake was that then, when it was leaked by Snowden, it all came out on, if you like, on hostile terms. It was portrayed as an all-seeing, all-encompassing capability, which it just wasn't. I mean, you would know that if Western governments were capable of gathering every bit of information on every citizen, synthesize it all together into this great picture of you and me and so forth, you would have noticed it by now. It was actually a much more subtle set of capabilities, but actually, reputationally, we took a lot of damage, and we had to do more to explain that the way these actual capabilities work. So I just think in the 21st century, in a less deferential age, where people quite rightly, this is a good thing, are willing to challenge, the power and authorities of the state. I think when governments use technology for security, they need to, you can't obviously say, look, this is the way we use this particular capability, because then the capability is useless. But I think you have to talk to people proactively, and it's not the sort of thing that will excite tabloid newspapers, but it will interest some parliamentarians. It will interest civic groups. I remember then the lesson of that when we started to do cybersecurity. I mean, as per the previous answer, one of the sort of magical things that we started doing was fusing bits of policy expertise with the technical expertise. And so everybody in cybersecurity when I started was banging on about information sharing as a solution to everything. And a few of us got together and I said, look, I don't understand the tech the way you guys do, but I've been here a year and everybody's talking about information sharing. They've been talking about information sharing for the last 10 years.
They still are.
They still are. But, they're talking about it as the panacea to it. What's the evidence for this? And I said, well, we're so glad you said that, because actually we're wondering about this. And so we said, well, instead of just, information sharing has its place, but let's do something else. So we started looking at things that the market wasn't solving, because there was no commercial incentive to. So we started looking at things such as blocking dodgy domains from distributing their emails because they were clearly spoofing them, blocking access to known malicious destinations, and stuff like that sounds pretty scary from a civil liberties point of view. So learning the lessons of that period, we actually, invited in some of the NGOs that were interested in civil liberties. We treated them respectfully. They treated us respectfully. They didn't always agree with what we were doing, but if we hadn't done that, then I think they could legitimately have said that under the auspices of cybersecurity, the state was building some new mass surveillance system, which we weren't. There were aspects of it they didn't like, and they put up, and we published details and they published responses, but it was a respectful, constructive dialogue. And actually, to their credit, when we did all of this stuff, the civil liberties organizations said there's stuff about this we don't like, but it's not a new all-encompassing surveillance system. It's just not. So I think you need to engage, you need to have a little bit more transparency, and you need to show people that ultimately you are doing what is necessary to secure free and open communications, not using the threat to free and open communications as a ruse by which to curtail, individual freedoms and liberties. I think that's really, really important, and that's where the values come in.
And I definitely think I love the phrase you use, in a less deferential age, and the age of security services or intelligence services, as we would refer to it in Australia, saying trust us, is certainly over. And I think that is actually a good thing, as long as there is respectful contestability in that space, which is partly why we invited you on for today's podcast, is because you're in quite a unique position. So when I was in Tallinn at SciCon, I had the opportunity to interview the spokesperson for Cyber Partisans, the Belarusian hacktivist group. And that podcast raised all sorts of interesting and thorny ethical questions about the activities of groups that are non-state actors. And we wanted to have on somebody who could speak in an informed way from knowing what it was actually like on the inside, but also someone who has a little bit more freedom to be able to actually speak about these issues, which is why we were delighted when you agreed to come on. Perhaps before we dive into some of those more thorny questions, we can just do a little bit of scene setting in terms of the situation and where we're at in terms of the use of cyber operations in Ukraine. So what's your view? There's a lot of commentary about this, and increasingly we're seeing more and more evidence of cyber operations playing a role on the ground in Ukraine. What's your position on the role of cyber? Has it played out the way that you expected to? What are some sort of key lessons that you're taking out of it?
Well, we will be studying, those of us in the field, you, me, others, will be studying this for years to come. So I think all conclusions are preliminary at the minute, because sadly the war is still very much going on. I think one thing I expected, but and probably you expected, but plenty of others less familiar with the field might not have, was that it is cyber is a less dramatic feature of the conflict than some may have thought. There was a lot of pretty excitable commentary in the run up to the invasion and the early days after it about the first cyber war, and that it would drag in the West, and come back to that in particular. And sadly, as we're reminded on a daily basis, the decisive factors in this conflict have been pretty traditional in their brutality and horror. And I think those of us who understood cyber capabilities aren't that surprised by that. I mean, I always try to distinguish. Now it's an imperfect distinction, but I always try and explain to people who are much less familiar with the discussion of if you think. Sometimes people say, well, we're moving away from traditional infantry towards high-tech weapons and cyber. High-tech weapons and cyber aren't the same thing. A high-tech missile is just a higher-tech version of a lower-tech missile. It still hits something, destroys it, possibly kills or hurts people. A cyber capability is some code, and it depends what you do with it, and it depends what happens at the other end. And so it's very much a sort of secondary capability. And when you look at the course of the conflict so far, and you look at the big turning points and decisive moments, it's pretty hard to think of a identifiable cyber event, either one that's been obvious to see, as some cyber incidents are, or widely rumored as sort of Stuxnet type thing that everybody knows about, even if nobody officially says it happens, and so on. So that's the one thing that I think we would have expected, that it was an important but secondary capability on both sides. And you saw that with Russia and the Viasat hack at the start of the conflict. A very classic sort of clinical operation designed to weaken Ukraine's military communications system. I think the thing that slightly surprised me a little bit was the absence of, so far at least identifiably, of any sort of escalatory action against the West. Now, to some extent, again, the bit where this didn't surprise me was I reject the sort of characterization of cyber. We can do things secretly and unattributably all the time, So Russia would do things to the West in cyberspace that it wouldn't dare do in the real world. Well, I don't really buy that, because if there was a major attack on US critical infrastructure that bore all the hallmarks of a sophisticated nation state attack and was doing all sorts of damage, or in the UK, or one of the big NATO countries, I don't think it would take people terribly long to work out who'd done it, and I don't see why the consequences of that would have been any different from, say, another horror like Salisbury and the chemical weapons attack, or an accidental incursion over a border, or what have you. The Western country. So I'm not surprised Russia hasn't done, pretty overt aggression. I'm a little surprised, pleasantly, that the ransomware operators arguing under, if you like, the tacit license of the Russian state, who caused so much havoc in 2021, seem to have been quieter. And a little surprised that there hasn't been a little bit more sort of tentative cyber disruption from the Russian state. And then the bit that I think has surprised all of us, and I know this is what you said that we might go on to talk about, is, if you like, the information contest with a myriad of different actors, non-state states, where Ukraine is not just giving as good as it gets, but probably winning that side of the contest. Although again, I would be slightly cautious about that characterization, and that they're certainly not losing, and they're certainly winning in terms of the battle for Western hearts and minds. Whether they're influencing opinion in Russia itself is something else, and of course that's what matters in terms of bringing the conflict to some form of conclusion. So yeah, those three things, I think it's forced us into a more realistic appraisal of what cyber capabilities are in war. They're not magic. They're a sort of important secondary capability. There's been less against the West, but I suppose that's because Russia's trying not to drag the West directly into the conflict in most ways, so it's probably not going to do it in cyber. And then I think it is very, very interesting what's happening in the contested information domain, in particular the non-state elements of it.
So before we move on to the non-state elements, to what extent do you think that a calculation of the risk of escalation is impacting Putin's decisions on the use of cyber tools? Or, you referred to the fact that you're, surprised that the ransomware gangs maybe aren't as active as we had seen last year. one might think, and it is a major might, that there is some element of control that has been, or a directive been given for them to avoid escalation. There is quite a lot of commentary to that effect. There's also quite a lot of commentary that says that level of command and control just simply doesn't exist. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
Again, and by the way, I should have said congratulations on your excellent and really well-received SciCon presentation and all of this. I, again, will be studying it for years, and I think it's hard to know definitively because, understanding it requires some knowledge of Kremlin decision-taking, which I don't have, and I'm sure not many people have, and those who do probably aren't allowed to say what they know.
Yes, exactly.
But I think it's the lack. So I think the lack of escalation, particularly against the West, is probably part of it. But I think there are other factors as well, potentially, and it's probably a combination of all of them. So part of it is, firstly, we should acknowledge that Russia did do some really targeted, some medium quality, some high quality operations against Ukraine at the start. Secondly, there is, of course, the supposition that Russia was assuming a quick military conquest, and therefore you didn't need a lot of cyber, and actually you'd want to leave the internet infrastructure of Ukraine as touched as possible, so you could use it and govern the country once you've occupied it. There is something about, if the overall campaign was badly prepared and badly planned, then why should cyber be any different? Particularly when you take the lead times for cyber operations. If you look at the power grids, if you look at the work of, say, Leonard Maschmeyer in Zurich, who has studied the two power grid outages in 2015 and 2016 in Kyiv, and said that the first one took 18 months to plan, the second took 31 months to plan and execute. Well, if you're not ready, you're not going to do a sophisticated cyber operation in a couple of weeks. And indeed, there was another attempt on the Ukrainian power grid, but instead of taking 18 months to plan and execute it, they took 2 weeks. And funnily enough, it wasn't very good. So there's that sort of element as well. But I think part of it does go back. I heard Rob Lee of Dragos say that, an ex-US military person say that, part of it is you envisage that meeting where the military commander or the president says, what are my options against this broadcasting facility? And the Air Force person says, well, now that we're in a full-scale invasion, I can fly over it and bomb it and be back within 48 hours with a 98% chance of success. And the cyber person says, give me 6 months and I'll give you a 70% chance of partial disruption. So there's an element of that, I think, in all of it. That's about Ukraine. I do still think, though, that there is a bit where, we talk a lot about the efficacy of attribution. Is attribution worth the hassle and all the rest of it? Is it worth the risk of getting it wrong, etc.? Because it's hard. But I think actually, although it's really hard to prove this, it's impossible to prove it. I think this is potentially shown some of the advantages of attribution, because the Russian state knows that the UK, the US, Australia, NATO countries, some NATO countries are willing to put in a lot of the time and effort to study Russian TTP, to get to know the actors, to publish details of what they do, and to prove to the satisfaction of many objective experts that this is Russian state activity. Therefore, that you can't do some of this stuff unattributably. So it removes, as I was saying earlier, it removes that sort of sense of magic secret capability from cyber. In other words, look, if you want to provoke America, then you can do counter sanctions, you can do some risky human operation on US soil, or you can do a cyber attack, but cyber doesn't give you something that you can get away with that the others don't. So I think maybe, I do think, to answer your question, and with apologies, a slightly long-winded way, that risk of escalation, because we now are willing to attribute and at least try to impose some sort of response, I think it is part of the story.
part of what we focus on in this podcast is the policy elements. And I think the story of attribution is one that has kind of, we take almost for granted now that countries are willing to, when the circumstances and when the incident is serious enough, that they will stand up and say China did it, or Russia did it, or Iran did it, or DPRK did it. But actually, until 2017 in Australia, at least, we had never done that. We always said, we will not comment on intelligence matters. And that is, quite a significant development in a period of just over 5 years of policy potentially having an impact in terms of shaping behaviour. And certainly in the UN negotiations I was involved in, Russia became allergic to the words attribution and response, which I think are as close as you will get, Ciaran, to evidence of your theory that you have just put forward. Now, it wouldn't be a podcast talking about cyber Ukraine from Australia without asking the question of what do you think China is learning from what's unfolding in Ukraine? Very interested in your perspectives from that, particularly in the context of Taiwan and any potential Chinese activity in that space.
It's interesting, and I don't want to sort of overdo this because I'm not I keep talking about things I'm not, and I'm not a military strategist or military expert. But I think that if there was anyone in the
very
Chinese,
humble as well. Sorry, go for it.
But if there was anyone in the Chinese system that thought that having a large cyber capability somehow made it easier to conquer to the point of permanent occupation, a rich island of several million pro-independence people, having some sophisticated computer capabilities doesn't really make that much easier. And I think they will understand that. I think from the Taiwanese point of view, based on the Russian experience of invading Ukraine, they will know that the cybersecurity of things like air defense systems are absolutely critically important. I'm sure they knew that anyway, but it's a pretty useful reminder for them. So I think it will be a reminder that harassing countries with whom you are towards whom you are hostile, and actually conquering a landmass are very different things. I think one of the things we've got to keep track of, though, is sadly there is a much wider sort of tech context beyond and global security context beyond Ukraine at the minute, and I know various policymakers worry about, necessarily having to focus on the attention of focusing attention on Russia, which, in the analogy beloved of British security chiefs at the moment, is severe bad weather, and not therefore focusing on China, which is climate change. And you see that a little bit, I think, and for example, and you mentioned some of the UN negotiations. You see that a little bit in the discussion around norms in cyberspace, and I find it really interesting. So there's a lawfare piece by me and Dr. Andrew Dwyer recently, where amongst other things, we're looking at the UK Attorney General's speech on lawful context in cyberspace. She doesn't really name many countries very often, but all the activities she talks about is basically Russian. It's the sort of stuff Russia does, disrupting, energy grids, criminals based in Russia disrupting healthcare systems. And actually, if you read it by omission, all the stuff that the West has been screaming about, including Australia in one of its first attributions with the UK and the US, Chinese IP theft and the undermining of Western economies, is completely skated over. And actually, if you look at the substance of her speech, it's almost saying, well, Russia does all of this and that's wrong and would violate any set of international norms, but it doesn't actually. We've gone from a position in 2015 when President Obama was more or less threatening sanctions against President Xi for intellectual property theft, to the fact that the British government has just said, almost by its silence, legitimized that. So I think we need to keep our focus on that. The big change that I see in China, and this was very much in the last 2 years of my time. It crystallized around the Huawei 5G issue, but it was much, much bigger than that. Was that, if I take the first sort of 4 of my 6.5 years running UK cybersecurity operations, and you think about China in that period, for the first sort of 4 years, we were thinking of China as mean, operationally, it was quite hard as a cyber adversary, but conceptually, it was dead easy. So China had this huge, army of hostile computer network exploiters, many of them directly working for the military and the 3PLA, with traditional espionage objectives, some, but not as much as Russia, disruptive objectives, but mostly sort of economic espionage and so forth. And your job was to try and make it as hard for them as possible, and make sure they got as little as possible out of you. And some days you'd win, some days they'd win, because that's the way attritional cyber contests work. Towards the end of the period, though, I mean, that was almost priced in as business as usual for us as government, for big business, and so forth. And we were much more thinking about, unlike Russia, and this is where the climate change versus severe bad weather comes in. Russia does not have its own internet. Russia just cheats on the one that America built. China, it's got a handful. Russia's got a handful of interesting AV companies, and that's about it. China has this whole tech system, massively subsidized, which has come from pretty much nothing 25 years ago to being something that it has realistic ambitions to compete with the US for global leadership of tech. It operates very differently. It's more statist. It's easier to control, and of course now the internet is splitting into two technospheres where China is competing for sort of influence. Taiwan is obviously at the center of that with all the sanctions and chip manufacturing stuff, etc., etc. What's interesting about that is that it goes way beyond cybersecurity. Cybersecurity of components and so on is part of that, but it's about trade, it's about diplomacy. The challenge for the West is that the West has some inbuilt advantages. Free markets spurring innovation being the main one. The consumer signal, this is what we want, and therefore this is what you should build. But China has some advantages too. This huge domestic market, subsidies, deep pockets, intellectual property theft, and no need to worry about elections. Whereas and if you take the 5G crisis over infrastructure, at the heart of that was the fact that the Western market was far too fragmented, and basically there were very few options for Western companies. And how do you manage having industrial capability, particularly in hardware, in things like AI, synthetic biology, whatever you have, all these emerging technologies that China wants to dominate as per the Made in China 2025 strategy? How do you manage that across the West without interfering unduly in free markets? And my question is always, if you look at, I think leaders now get this, Washington gets it, London gets it, Canberra gets it, but if you look at the G7 declaration from the Cornwall summit in the summer of 2021, it's beautifully and elegantly written about this challenge, expresses it way better than I just did. The problem is, if that were a NATO summit, the NATO bureaucracy and a bunch of defense ministries would then cooperate on some actions afterwards. It's a G7 summit. What happens afterwards? There's no infrastructure. That's not a criticism. The G7 is basically an economic sort of, collaborative body, but, we're designed to compete with each other in a friendly and open way under clear rules. So how do you make tech markets work in a way that sustains Western free, open industrial capability against this challenge is a really, really hard international public policy problem. So that's where I think the Chinese challenge really is now. Just seeing off its 3PLA is a relatively simple problem compared to that.
Oh, Ciaran, I can feel a rabbit hole appearing because everything you have just discussed is something that I'm actually writing on right now. So this concept of if you are to compare the two systems, and I love your description of two technospheres, you have on the Chinese side a system that is low cost, innovative, and allows control. On our side, we still have very innovative technologies, but tend to be more expensive, and they really are not enabling control. If anything, they're facilitating chaos. And so one of the things that I'm looking at the moment is how do we actually rebrand both Western technology, but also the concept of democracy to make it something that is attractive to countries who are looking at these two propositions and making a choice about which technosphere they're going to be joining. Because of course, once you join one or the other, you can move about, you can change, but similar to when you choose between an Apple or an Android operating system, moving between them is complicated and costly. So
a really nice way, a really nice analogy. One of
Yeah.
the obvious when you've thought about it, but I hadn't, so thank you.
I have done a lot of thinking about this, Ciaran, and I think you are absolutely spot on that this is something that Western leaders have recognised, but in the words of Elvis Presley, is something that we probably need a little bit less conversation and a little bit more action on. There's some work forthcoming from me on that subject. I would love to talk more about norm setting as well, but maybe we'll come back to that because I don't want to miss the opportunity to delve down into some of these issues, looking at the different types of groups that are non-state actors that are operating in this space. The conversation that I had with the Belarusian Cyber Partisans was really eye-opening to me in the sense that this is a group of people who are passionate about bringing democracy to their country and using technology to help them to do that. And this is a group that is largely Belarusian, and they have claimed responsibility, for example, for interrupting Russian troop movements on the Belarusian railways using both cyber and kinetic means, which is interesting in terms of the combination. How do you contrast a group, or do you contrast a group like Cyber Partisans with a group like Anonymous that has no leadership, doesn't really have command and control? In fact, they pride themselves on not having the command and control, which, for example, claimed responsibility for the hack of Russian state TV, which was, demonstrating for a very short period the carnage that Russia was wreaking in Ukraine. And then just to make it extra thorny for you, how do you distinguish between Cyber Partisans Anonymous and something like the Ukrainian IT army, where the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has called on people to come to their aid and is organised through a Telegram channel where Russian targets are listed for volunteers to be engaged in? They're, to me, three quite distinct sets of actors. Is it black and white, or should we be distinguishing between them?
This is an incredibly difficult and sensitive subject, and you mentioned humility. I think I would start with some humility. I'm not sitting in a country, either Ukraine, where being invaded and people being killed in obscene numbers, nor am I in Belarus with a brutal regime. So, sitting in the relative comfort of southern England, I sort of speak tentatively on this. I do think your categorization is helpful. Excuse me. I do think your categorization is helpful, and it is, but there will be messy interfaces between them all. But I think trying to bring some sort of conceptual order to it does help us think about it. I think because of that humility, given the conditions that people in Belarus and people in Ukraine face, I don't think you can say, look, because of the risks of escalation, because of the risks of accidental consequences, or because of the risks of this concept being misapplied in the future when the war is over, you shouldn't be doing this. I don't think you can say that. It's just not fair to people in that situation. And also, what's the point? They're going to do it anyway. So it does help to break it down. I'll probably do them in a slightly different order. The Ukrainian IT army, I think, is an interesting construct where, and again, others, including yourself, will know more about the exact details of this than I will. But I think it's quite a careful construct in that, and if you look at, for example, what Viktor Zhorov, the Ukrainian cybersecurity agency, has said in public, the Ukrainians are very careful what they take ownership of and what they don't. So, the Ukrainian IT army will draw on draw on capabilities that aren't technically employed by the state, but it seems that they will try and exercise control and restraint, so they aren't just people doing all sorts of freelancing activity, which could go horribly wrong and have unintended consequences. And therefore, Ukrainians, and I think this is quite smart, are clever about what they will take responsibility for as the state and what they will not, even if they draw on the skills of people who are not wearing uniforms, who are not possibly not even in Ukraine. So I think, of course, the risk there is that how on earth do you control that via a Telegram channel? But the risk management of it so far seems to have been okay. Then you turn to the Belarus Cyber Partisans, and even before, of course, the war, they were quite interesting. They had leaked footage of alleged apparent human rights abuses by the regime. And I thought that was a really, really interesting development. And you saw some of it, some similar activity in Iran as well, where dissident groups are using, if you like, the tools that are normally used by the state against dissidents. The dissidents were, if you like, using those tools against the state. And again, it's really hard to complain about. That. I think there, because they're a non-state group, you have to hope, but insofar as you can, talk to them, encourage them to think in the way that a responsible state would about responsible behaviour, that you don't do things that could have the high risk of deeply unintended consequences, whether those are escalatory, accidental, precedent setting, and so forth. But you would be, given that, there are ways of getting comfortable with that sort of activity. I think the anonymous type stuff is the hardest, and potentially in precedent terms the riskiest. You can't really. It's hard really to say to the Ukrainians, no, you shouldn't draw in a controlled way on the services of volunteers. It's certainly hard to say to people in Belarus who are prepared to take these horrendous risks to their own safety and that of their families, that they shouldn't be, trying to expose torture. They shouldn't be trying to slow down trains carrying lethal weaponry. What would concern me is if there's lots of uncontrolled activity coming from all over the world, allegedly in support of Ukraine, with no governance or risk management at all, and that would concern me essentially for two broad reasons. One is it could go badly wrong, and the second is it does create a very, very difficult precedent, because it appropriates to a bunch of people. The Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian IT army, is an internationally accountable entity. If Belarus ever sees political reform, then the Belarusian cyber partisans presumably would aspire to become a regulated entity within a free and democratic Belarus. A bunch of people who say, here's a situation in the global environment that I don't like, and therefore I'm going to take to my laptop to do something about it. If that precedent is accepted, then we're into quite difficult territory when it comes to anything from climate change to, there were people having a go at the Royal Lifeboat Institute in the UK because they didn't like what they were doing to protect people making migrants making the channel crossing. Is that legitimate because you don't like what the RNLI are doing to have a go at them? There are any number of actions that you could take because you don't like the politics of a particular situation. And that's the area of this really queasy about. So I think your differentiation is actually really helpful because it shows that there are times where people who are not directly affiliated to a lawfully governed state can undertake activity responsibly and usefully in this type of situation. But there is a difference between that and just anybody having a go in any situation that they don't like. There will, of course, be horribly messy examples that will, that will test that differentiation. But I still think it's important to try to make it.
And I have a lot of empathy for Western officials who are coming out and making statements that we strongly discourage Australians becoming involved in the conflict via cyber means, etc. What I find interesting about that is that they're framing it as this would be a violation of Australian criminal law. And I find it interesting that there's very little commentary about the implications from international humanitarian law, the fact that if an Australian is a participant in the conflict, the risk of becoming a belligerent in the conflict and therefore a legitimate target under the laws of armed conflict. And I find that it's an observation that I make of a lot of the current conversation, to the extent that anyone is actually willing to engage in a public conversation on these issues. And I really commend you, Ciaran, for doing it. You made the point about drawing in a controlled manner on volunteers. And you also made the point that this is going to happen, that this type of activity is happening. So do you think we need to be considering particular policy, regulatory, or doctrine updates to harness those volunteers in that controlled way? You've mentioned some criteria there. Would there be anything that you would be thinking about that from a policy and a regulatory perspective, rather than just sort of saying, oh, we discourage you from doing this, how can we actually potentially harness it?
I think there's something in that that's worthy of serious study, and it sounds like I'm dodging the question, and to some extent I am, because I think it's very hard to specify what such a framework would look like. But there's something about, there's something about where the effort of experts in the field is directed, and where the effort of government, where the efforts of government are directed, and sometimes whether it's, for example, in a completely separate field, I think sometimes when we talk about global governance of the internet, we don't talk enough about people's duty to protect the security of the infrastructure. Separate issue, but we talk an awful lot about you're not stealing intellectual property, but we don't really talk about duty to protect infrastructure. Here, if you look at, you mentioned international humanitarian law, there's an awful lot of discussion around things like, well, you don't attack hospitals. And I can see why, but there's quite evocative stuff around, well, this thing about, hospitals will stop working in war zones because their power will be disconnected, and, people will die in the middle of operating theatres. And as we've seen from this conflict, whilst that is a possibility, actually the nature of cyber capabilities means that that doesn't happen very often, at least yet. So, in some respects, I would encourage the international, in the light of the experience of the Russia-Ukraine war, I would encourage some of the effort on international law on sort of cyber conflict moving away from just, in a sense, repeating let's not attack hospitals, towards some of these really thorny issues. We now have, and that's a combination of domestic law, as you say. There'll be people in Australia, in the UK, there'll be people all over the place talking about, their own citizens and how it interacts with domestic law. But what are the circumstances in which it is legitimate? What are the responsibilities in somebody like the Ukrainian IT army on, the Belarus cyber partisans? Where might lines be drawn, if it is possible to draw lines? And I think it would be useful. And it's not a field with which I'm deeply acquainted, probably not nearly as deeply acquainted as you are with it, Johanna, but I get the impression, certainly from, what I can see and read from the outputs of these things, that that's not been a huge field of study and negotiation and consideration so far. And I think that's actually what we should be getting at, because you mentioned, to your previous question when I took you down the rabbit hole, what are the implications for potential China-Taiwan?
A wonderful rabbit hole.
Well, yes, but there's one of them, so if there is some sort of heightened tension, or even hopefully there isn't, but some sort of invasion context, well, what happens there? And we should be looking at this experience to try to guide us as we face those sorts of situations in future.
And I think that's actually the perfect way to frame it. I certainly want to emphasize at this point that I'm asking these questions not because I'm encouraging people to take up and become volunteers. I'm asking these questions because I want to encourage the scholarship of exactly the nature that you're describing. I've been involved in a lot of these conversations, and the few times that I have raised this question, the responses has been sort of, no, that's too sensitive, we can't discuss it. And I think that's not the right response. We actually need to look at what can we learn from what's happening in Ukraine so that we can be better prepared if and when we're in a situation where, heaven forbid, we're taking up arms ourselves.
Well, absolutely. And if you look at, and there was a controversy about this in the UK because at the start of the conflict, various people in the UK said they wanted to go physically to Ukraine and take up arms. A senior government minister, who may be the next prime minister, sort of was seen to tacitly encourage this. But if you go onto the British government's Ministry of Defence website, it says explicitly, no, you shouldn't do this. Here's the international law of armed conflict. Here's what your status would be, etc., etc. Of course, two British immigrants, long-term immigrants to Ukraine, who were captured by the pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, have been sentenced to death on the grounds that they are wrongly, in the grounds that they are in the separatists, pro-Russian separatist view, mercenaries. They're actually immigrants who have uniformed Ukrainian soldiers. The reason I'm telling that story is that there is something, if a British citizen feels minded to toy with the idea of going to Ukraine to fight, the government says something to them about what their situation would be in those circumstances. Well, if a British citizen says, I want to hack to help Ukraine, what do we tell them?
Yeah. And there is, apart from we strongly discourage you from doing so, there is very little official advice in this space. And, I do have empathy for the officials that are dealing with this situation, in the sense that it's sensitive. Putting out this type of advice takes time and consideration. I guess that what I'm hoping this podcast helps to do is to prompt the conversation that allows them to do that in an informed way. Maybe let's turn away from the really sensitive issue, Ciaran, and talk a little bit about something that has really stood out to me as well, which is also non-state actors, but in the sense of the private sector and the role of the private sector in Ukraine. Because I think there have been tech companies, Microsoft has been particularly active on the ground in Ukraine, taking the entirety of Ukraine's government data from on-prem data centers that were being, with bombs being dropped on them, to the cloud in a lightning speed period of time. But we've also seen many cybersecurity firms active on the ground, etc. When I was speaking with Ukrainian cyber officials, including Victor Zora, who, anyone who's interested in this, I really recommend you following him on Twitter, because he's very discreet in what he puts out, but when he does, it's very considered. Talking with Victor, listening to the Ukrainian officials describing the early days of the Russian invasion and the sort of overwhelming amount of support that came from the private sector, there really was a sense of it was total chaos. And of course, war is chaos. I appreciate that, but I do wonder, in a similar vein to the conversation we just had about hacktivist groups, whether there is something that we can learn in terms of the coordination to better coordinate between private sector cyber defenders and government and militaries in times of conflict. Is there something that we should be putting in place, or policies, etc., that we should be considering now in that area?
It's really interesting what happened, and again, it's a bit like your segmentation of the non-state actors on behalf of Ukraine. There's a huge divergence of what happened with the private sector support. I mean, the starting point of this, of course, is that as well as a country like Ukraine, or any country for that matter, but obviously Ukraine facing invasion, it has a risk. It has a set of it has an attack surface that ranges all the way through from high-end military assets all the way through to the disruption of civilian life. And the Russian attacks around the time of the invasion ranged from Viasat on essentially military communications, albeit provided by the private sector, all the way through to banks and government websites and that sort of thing. The private sector response, I mean, there was sort of almost darkly funny article in the Financial Times about it. I remember reading where it was talking about the sort of private sector surge, if you like, the US government-sponsored private sector surge. And in my mind, a number of other cybersecurity commentators, it sort of rather amusingly conflated what you might call, the really strategically impactful things, urgent upgrades to Ukrainian military cybersecurity, the sort of thing you're talking about with Microsoft taking over, if you like, cloud protection of massive data sets, all the way through with putting in DDoS protection in some energy companies and making it sound like the evacuation of Dunkirk. So it was a huge range of activity, some of which was quite basic. I think it would be very hard to codify this, but there's something you can codify it a bit. And I mean, tentatively, in a very different context, I think the UK has some decent practice here. So, I mean, the UK sort of, in the last 10 years in particular, has absolutely jettisoned a traditional hostility to private sector threat intelligence and other capabilities. If it's there, just use it. And actually, the companies, including the American companies and the other non-British companies, have been absolutely wonderful in terms of their willingness to share and collaborate. I mean, there's almost a sort of sweet spot of stuff which can be useful to the government, and therefore, by definition, it's not really commercially sellable, and they're very happy to give it. And we're not precious about if it comes from CrowdStrike or whoever. We're very happy to. Well, certainly when I was in government, we were always very happy to have it. So, and if I go back, I mean, I'm given we just had the 5th anniversary of WannaCry. I'm getting lots of people, researching that and so forth. And sure, it was chaotic, and not as chaotic as a full-scale invasion of a sovereign country, but a major incident in the first few weeks of a new organization. It was pretty chaotic. And one of the things that helped was this, tapestry of relationships with the private sector cybersecurity company. It's funny if you look at, for example, if you contrast it, one of the criticisms of the UK government's response to COVID was the fact that actually when the crisis hit, you just didn't have a set of scalable relationships with the private sector. And not only did you not have the infrastructure, you didn't even have the contacts and the skills and so forth. I think actually in cyber, and hopefully I'm not proved wrong by any sort of subsequent incident, you might not have a highly refined framework, but you certainly have a lot of contacts and mobilizable capabilities in the private sector. And I think that's a really, really useful thing to have. So you can sort of, and actually you had a culture of people, and I hate being over reliant on culture because, it's very easy for that to go wrong. But you have a set of people who think, well, if the government calls me, being fully protective of my own private commercial interests and so forth, there is some useful thing we can do. We can collaborate, we can get around, we can deploy things. So I think it is probably worth looking at this carefully and thinking about learning the lessons of Ukraine, looking at some good practice in the UK. There's plenty of good practice elsewhere, including in Australia. How do you mobilize the scale of the private sector? But actually, I think it's doable, and in fact, I think it's done. It can be improved, but it's actually a strength of the Western response system, in my view. And I think Ukraine showed that. I mean, for a US-led, and UK and others were involved, but for a US-led, if you like, cybersecurity mission to say, like, we'll send over a bunch of guys, men and women from uniformed institutions, but there won't be that many of them. I mean, but look at what they're bringing. It's really, really quite impressive.
And I think the thing that stands out to me about the framework, the connections, the contacts, the culture that exists within the cybersecurity community, that is there and is readily available to be drawn upon if you're talking about a situation that directly affects Australia. I think it adds an extra dimension when the countries to whom's assistance that you're going to is a third country. And I think there's something there about the coordination between countries and cooperation on the private sector that would be useful.
There is, and that prompted me. I mean, even sorry to interrupt, but even in peacetime and pre-war time, if you like, I think it was 2016. The UK and others, urged NATO, which then adopted, to do a NATO industry cyber partnership, which is kind of like that, but for NATO. And actually, it wasn't really about emergency capabilities. It was about strengthening cyber resilience and defenses outside of war. But how do you use the private sector to do it? How do you, if you like, know what's out there and how to get it? So there was a framework established by NATO to do that, which I thought was really quite powerful.
Well, maybe we'll find that and add a link in the pod notes. Ciaran, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I want to ask you two final questions, both of which should be quick ones. One is, despite all of your humility in saying you're not an expert in this field, you have been working in this field for a very, very long time. What is something that you're thinking about, concerned about, that other people aren't talking about that you think we need to be focused on at the moment?
Well, I don't have anything which nobody's talking about, but I think one of the priorities strategically is tech's changing, and the business model for tech's changing, and the configuration of tech is changing. IoT is a great example where instead of being based on free access to web services by giving away lots of personal data, which is what we've had mostly hitherto, you're paying for a product and a service, and it's much easier to inspect and regulate and so forth. And that's why loads of countries, the UK, EU, Singapore, are looking at sort of IoT legislation. I think that's a really good template for tech of the future. Applied AI, quantum. We have a massive opportunity in the next 10 years to remedy a structural defect in the way we've done technology, because, to be fair to our predecessors 20, 30 years ago, they couldn't foresee how quickly the internet-based economy was going to take off and in what way. Now we can't see the contours of future tech, so let's famously, the internet was not designed with security in mind, but there's a new phase of tech coming through, so let's design it with security in mind. That's the big thing. There's a conversation there with manufacturers, with regulators. It doesn't all have to be regulation. It can be multiple things, but let's make sure that the new tech that comes online, that we know what broadly it's going to look like, is much safer.
Yeah, and I would add safety, security, and privacy, as our e-safety commissioner calls it, the three-legged stool. So, Ciaran, the last question we always ask is books, podcasts, recommendations. What do you read when you want to get up to speed on issues, or what would you recommend for people who would like to get up to speed on some of the things that we've been talking about?
That is a great question, obviously, on international cyber governance and the contestation of cyberspace. Then I would recommend you and this. I think on books and so forth, I'm very taken by what Ben Buchanan has done on state activity, the hacker in the state, because I think, in the light of the war, even though it was published 4 or 5 years before the war, that sort of analysis of what states do in cyberspace has really been borne out. At an organisational level, it's almost more like a manual than a book. But Dr. Jessica Barker here in the UK has written this thing, Confident Cybersecurity, which is just basically, if you were just from the point of view of an organisational defender, or thinking about the industry as a whole, ignoring the geopolitics and just saying, look, how do you keep something safe? It's actually really sort of good at demystifying things. So those would just be some suggestions. But mostly, I think, the main thing is that people should be curious about this stuff and not scared of it. I mean, the big enemy in all of this is fear.
Be curious, don't be scared of it. Couldn't think of better words to end on, Ciaran. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Thank you very much.
Tech Mirror is a podcast of the Tech Policy Design Centre at the Australian National University. This episode was produced on Ngunnawal lands by Jack Fox. Ben Gowdie provided invaluable research and post-production support. If you would like to support the pod, please give us a 5-star rating, or even better, leave us a short review. This really helps us to get the word out. We also love it when you send us questions or comments. We read them all. You can find out more by following us on Tech Policy Design on Twitter or LinkedIn, or Google Tech Policy Design Centre and follow the links. Thanks for listening. Get in touch and get involved.